Do 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 do. Extras.
Like any real system of nobility, Vistria's noble caste has a lot of little quirks and details. We've already discussed the king, his dukes, the counts and earls, and the barons beneath them. Another title, Marquis, is given to rulers of dangerous border provinces, in honor of the greater risk and responsibility they hold. A marquis, like Draven, is equivalent to an earl or count in most ways, but is considered a slightly higher rank. I usually describe it as 10% of a rank higher, just for simplicity's sake. Though in Draven's case, there are far fewer circumstances where this extra consideration matters than there are cases where his landless status renders his rank nearly irrelevant. Below a count, earl, or marquis, the barons have the most local control. If you have a grievance that your local sheriff can't resolve, or a grievance with your sheriff, him or herself, a citizen of Vistria has the right to request an audience with their baron, or a representative from the baron's court. Theoretically, if you feel you're being abused or otherwise treated unfairly by your baron, you can go up to the count or earl, but in practice this is very rare. The higher ranks of nobles rarely deal directly with the concerns of peasants in this way. They deal primarily with the concerns and disputes between other nobles, and of course, with military matters. In the old days, barons had an important role in the defense of their realm against monsters and other threats, but over time, military control has shifted upwards, while barons maintain only a small force for defense of their stronghold and instead focus on policing, maintaining a force in each town for the prevention and investigation of crime. The highways are patrolled by the forces of the local count or earl, while the king and each duke maintain small elite forces, the Knights of the Realm or the Marshals of Mountside, for example. These groups have a police role for hunting down dangerous or cross-border criminals, as well as spies and the kinds of monster or supernatural threats which are more subtle than, say, an ogre attack, which sometimes puts these groups in jurisdictional conflict with the barons, and at other times with the hand of Sirius, but most of the time they work together because they're all on the same side. There's also one last stratum of nobility, the knights. Each noble, from barons up, has the right to knight particularly valuable servants, conferring upon them some authority to act in that noble's name, some of the privileges of nobility for themselves, but also a solemn oath and duty to their liege lord. Beyond that, it's a little hard to describe what knights do because different nobles use the institution of knighthood in completely different ways. A baron might knight a hero to combat monsters or other local threats because it takes time to notify and get help from their earl or duke or the hand of Sirius. A count might knight a trusted advisor or administrator to deal with a domestic issue or crisis, to resolve a strike, or to investigate corrupt officials. A duke might knight a hero to investigate a pattern of paranormal activity, or to become a champion on the battlefield with a degree of independence from the normal military structures. This isn't the only way to get noble standing in Vistrian society, though. There are many quirks and complexities of the system, the most notable being the free cities. As mentioned, earls pay taxes to their duke, whereas counts pay taxes directly to the king. The dukes also pay a small percentage of their income to the king. It's more symbolic, since dukes really need a lot of resources to defend the realm, but even a small percentage is still a lot of money, and all that money ultimately comes from the citizens of Vistria. So not long after Vistria solidified its modern borders, after the duchies had all been formed, there were a number of citizens in different parts of the country who felt that they were being taxed more than citizens in other areas, or they simply felt their taxes were too high. And these people began to congregate near the borders between counties or earldoms because one of the old laws, created by Doban the Just, decreed that if a town lay on the border between two fiefdoms and those lords disputed the jurisdiction, that town shall be placed under direct stewardship of the king and pay taxes only to the king. Now, these towns arose deliberately on the borders in order to avoid the jurisdiction of the local counts or earls, seeking more self-government and believing that with fewer levels of government between them and the king, they would pay lower taxes. This view proved fairly popular, and a number of people migrated, turning these independent-minded border towns into the great free cities, major trade hubs and perpetual annoyances to nearby lords. It was later established that if these cities lay on any border within a duchy, as Vanover does, they would still have to pay taxes to the duke. But although this assured the duke's responsibility for the defense of the cities, they still maintained most facets of the self-governance which had become tradition over the years. And part of that tradition is that the elected mayor of one of these cities is known as a burgher, who, as long as she holds office, is afforded noble standing equivalent to a baron, whereas the mayors of significant towns are normally considered equal to a knight, to ensure the proper degree of respect is extended up and down the tiers of society. Taking this one step further, the burgher of the capital city, castle, is called the seneschal, and his rank is considered equal to a marquis, so that he officially has the standing and independence to maintain the affairs of the capital city and to resist any influence from other important people, including, for example, the Marquis of the March of Castle, the province in which the capital lies. This also means that the seneschal commands the palace guard, a significant military force, whereas other mayors and burghers are not permitted to maintain military forces, only police. There are also a number of special titles with no particular military or political significance, which are held by tradition. For example, the Marquis of Smith's Rest, the mountainous province near Uruk where the smith ultimately died, to honor that hallowed site, that Marquis is normally introduced and referred to as cenotaph, rather than by his proper titles. There are plenty more examples, but they aren't all that relevant, and I don't want to be here all day long. Man, you would not believe how many times in the game and the videos that I mess up and refer to the Earl of Sword as a count. For some reason, that stuck in my head from early on, before I really figured out the reason for the division between the two titles. Counties and earldoms are equivalent provinces, other than the fact that earls answer to a duke, rather than directly to the king. The Earldom of Sword is clearly within the Duchy of Newland, so I really need to stop screwing that up. But here's a weird thing. The Earldom of Sword is named after this sword, the sword from a frost giant jarl who used to rule this area, until Vistria, first king of the nation, fought and slew him. Since then, the sword has been passed down by the Elstina family for generations, and eventually made into this table, which is the centerpiece of Baron Silverlode's dining hall. That's Draven's father-in-law. But if that's the case, why do they have the sword? Why isn't it sitting in the castle of the actual Earl of Sword? It's a bit of a long story. The short version is that historically, the Earl of Sword was in fact the Lord of Silverlode and the head of the Elstina family. But a little over 400 years ago, that title was stripped away from the Elstinas by King Vincent IV and transferred to the Baron of Steppe in their place. Around that time, the Earldom of Sword, and in particular the areas around the wealthy barony of Silverlode, had a problem with organized crime. There were reports of businesses being coerced into paying protection money, as well as a number of daring and costly highway robberies. In response, then Earl of Sword, Earl Marliotr Delstina, created a task force headed by his loyal servant and troubleshooter, Sir Smith Dulac. However, after only a few weeks, Dulac was slain during his investigations, and so his second-in-command, a man called Ander Brolin, took over. Ander proved an able leader indeed, shutting down the protection scams very quickly, and whenever the Earl received reports of highwaymen, Ander and his team moved in and shut them down quickly and decisively. Several more members of the task force fell in those first few months, but soon Ander had formed an iron core who, with the cooperation of the local guards and police, were so successful that within a year, organized crime in Sword had been reduced to a trickle. And so Earl Marliotr knighted Sir Ander Brolin for his competence and valor. There was another side to this story, though. Other nearby provinces were experiencing an increase in daring highway robberies at the same time that Sword saw this clear decline. In hindsight, you know exactly what was happening, but it wasn't so clear at the time, least of all to the Earl of Sword. Sir Ander had confronted the robbers, but rather than killing or capturing most of them, he used a show of force and some very compelling negotiation to convince the highwaymen to join a growing and much more subtle criminal enterprise. He really did shut down the protection racket, but as he did so, he recruited the most competent of those gangers and brought them into a more complex scheme made possible by his own authority, his trusted position within the court. Although Sir Ander had driven out nearly all highwaymen from the area, he insisted that they must remain vigilant, and the Earl gladly put him in charge of security for the caravans shipping his tax payments to the Duke. But Ander and his criminal partners had established a secret mint, having stolen, duplicated, and then just as secretly returned equipment to Silverlode's prestigious mint without anyone realizing it. With these minting plates, and using silver confiscated by the task force in those early raids, they stamped their own official-looking coinage, but mixing in other metals, reducing the purity of the silver. Then, they were able to launder the coins by switching them for real, pure silver coins of the tax shipment. At first, they tested the waters by making coins with only 10% less silver, which, when replacing whole ducal tax payments, made a decent profit. But when Sir Andor was able to infiltrate an enchanter into the unit that made the deliveries, a subtle spell helped ensure that anyone attempting to test the coin's purity would be magically attracted to a small set of authentic, pure silver ones, rather than a proper random test of the bogus shipment. After that, they were able to drastically cut the percentage of silver in their forged coins, daring to go as low as 60 or even 50%, while the criminals took their own profits in real coins, which they could spend without risk of discovery. It was many years and many tens of thousands of stolen gold later when the scheme was uncovered by Sir Jessica Prue of Ondar, when she was investigating the highwaymen for her own court. She tracked some of the thieves back to a headquarters where she encountered Fursh, an old and dangerous troll. Jessica barely escaped with her life, but with the aid of her party, she soon uncovered the connection. Fursh had become Sir Andor's partner, and the two of them had arranged for the troll to kill off all members of the original task force who would not join their criminal cabal. But Earl Marliater refused to believe her accusations. He accepted Sir Jessica's evidence regarding the troll, but would not believe his trusted crime fighter was actually the source of that crime, and Sir Andor was able to talk his way out of it, to the point that the Earl of Sword forced Sir Jessica to add him to her team. Anxious to cover himself and avoid being pinned to the crime, Sir Andor helped the investigators find leads to the troll's hideout, and even helped them in battle to protect his own good name. When they reached Fursh, the troll was outraged and shredded the double-dealing traitor alive. At great cost, Sir Jessica and her team finally managed to drop the troll, burning its body to ash and burying the steel-like jaws deeply in the hopes that would stop Fursh from growing back. Their heroism, and the death of Sir Andor, allowed the whole organization to be unraveled. Earl Marliater of Sword was embarrassed to have allowed this to transpire in his very court for years, and as more revelations came out about the depth of Sir Andor's crimes, King Vincent IV of Vistria and the Duke of Newland eventually came to the conclusion that the Earl had no knowledge or complicity in the crimes, but his incompetence in allowing it to go on was so great that he was forced to step down. The earldom was transferred to the Baron of Steppe, but the disgraced Elstina family was allowed to retain their barony, a title which passed to the eldest daughter, Maria d'Elstina, while her father was forced to retire a broken man. Their noble rank had been reduced, yes, but they still held their ancestral home, owned the wealthy lands and mines of Silverlode, and the Duke took pity on the new heir, and decreed that the ancient sword granted to her ancestor by a king so long ago was still her family's property. Maria d'Elstina always accepted the punishment handed to her father, and felt it was as fair and reasonable as could be hoped for. She knew that the king could have done far worse to her family, and that he could have done no less without losing face himself. But her own heirs did not all see things the same way, and over the centuries, the Elstina clan have worked extremely hard to rebuild their reputation and to take maximum advantage of their wealthy lands in the hope that they would one day be restored to their proper place. It is no mistake that they entertain guests around the very sword that once symbolized their position. There were a few things worth noting in the drawn-out combat encounter I had planned for Goodplace. I described the zombie minions pretty well in the episode. Stat-wise, they were harmless at this level, but they were helped a lot by the ability to deal 1d6 slashing damage automatically if they moved adjacent to an opponent who was already in melee with 2 or more zombies. The infused zombies, as I described them, were slightly modified from the stat block of the Dust Wight, page 47 of Monster Manual 3. Which is just a very solid CR7 fighting machine. I removed their special abilities, advanced them by a couple challenge rating worth of hit dice, and had the Necromancer enhance them with the spell Undead Torch, a buff from the spell compendium which grants undead creatures plus 2d6 negative energy damage against living creatures, and when they die, it leaves behind a patch that deals the same damage to anyone passing through their square. I don't even remember what I used as the stat block for the ooze full of skulls, but whatever it was, I stripped off its abilities too, and gave it the 2 gooey tentacle attacks. Essentially, if you're in range, it shoots out 2 tentacles. For each touch attack that hits, you're tethered to it, and it drags you 20 feet closer. They lose their grip on its next turn, so it has to hit you again, but while their damage is pathetic at range, once you are in melee, it can really go to work with acid, something this one never lived long enough to do. The main defining thing, though, at least until the next episode, was probably the specialized damage spell used by the Necromancer. It's a spell which I simply made up, which means the rules for it are probably too complicated. Corpsplosion is a level 3 necromancy spell on the Sorcerer Wizard list, or as an alternate level 3 spell for the Cleric Death Domain. It's a 20-foot radius burst within which you can selectively target any number of non-intelligent undead, each having hit dice less than half your caster level, up to a maximum of 5 hit dice. Undead under your control auto-fail the save, otherwise will save negates. Affected undead targets are destroyed, unleashing a deadly burst of negative energy within the spell's area, reflex save for half. For every 2 targets destroyed in this way, increase the reflex DC by 1, to a maximum of +5 save DC, and for each target destroyed, Corpsplosion deals D6 damage to all secondary targets within the burst area, which stacks up to 10d6, or 1d6 per caster level, whichever is lower. Any surviving undead within the burst, such as those not targeted, those who save, and those with more than 5 hit dice, they're all only healed for half the negative energy damage released by the spell. So the spell's damage cap is the same as a typical level 3 evocation like Fireball or Lightning Bolt. Now, negative energy is a much harder damage type to resist, and it heals undead, making it pretty powerful. This is the reason that Corpsplosion has to specify a 50% healing ratio. The fact that the spell has a built-in +5 save DC is really extraordinary and makes it potentially very lethal. Further, theoretically, you could use it as a save or die to sweep away enemy unintelligent undead, though the hit die cap prevents that from getting too crazy. The drawback to counter these rather crazy advantages, especially the save DC, is that you have to sacrifice between 5 and 10 of your own undead to achieve these effects. Is it still overpowered? Probably, but it would be hard to engineer a player character to take much advantage of it, and ultimately, it's still just 10d6 reflex for half, so it's not so far beyond the curve as to be insane. Or at least, that's the theory. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about running an RPG or anything else, you can ask them in the comments below, or tweet them to #RPGQA. I answer as many as I feel like, usually ignore questions about future episodes of TDDC, but otherwise ask away because yours may be the question that inspires my next video RPG Q&A.